And hello to everybody. Welcome to FourSight U. We are so excited today to have Gerard Puccio here to talk to us about new research that's just come out. In fact, he was baiting me at the beginning of this Zoom call and he said, I saved it. You haven't even heard it. So I'm really excited about this myself personally. I want to introduce Gerard. I know you all know him, but this is a video that I think will go beyond the FourSight crowd. So I want to introduce Gerard as a professor at the State University of New York, not just a professor, but a distinguished professor who is also chair of the Creativity and Change Leadership Department and has been chair for more than 20 years. Gerard has written more than 60 books, articles, journal articles, chapters around the subject of creativity, which has really been his life's work. His most recent book was Organizational Creativity. Book before that was Innovative Teams. He did for Great Courses, the Creativity Creators Toolkit. So he's worked at the organizational, team, and individual level supporting creativity. And we are lucky enough at FourSight to know Gerard as the author of the assessment, the FourSight Thinking Profile, and really the person who recognized there was something to measure about thinking preferences. People move through the problem-solving process differently, and that difference is something you can measure. And Gerard created an instrument that could measure it accurately. Yay, research, yay, Gerard. Okay, but what is really cool about that is that he not only created the assessment, but helped co-found the FourSight company with Blair Miller, another PhD, and the two of them have been supporting research around thinking preferences and what we know about FourSight ever since. So today is the most recent disclosure. I am on the edge of my seat like the rest of you about new research that's just come out, and I will turn it over to you, Gerard. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Appreciate that. And I feel like I'm among friends. So I look forward to the conversation. We're a fair-sized group here. So Sarah, as I'm going through the PowerPoint, if you kind of keep an eye on the chat box, if there's anything you want to raise to the level of the full group, by all means do that. And I'll encourage folks to jump in. You can raise a digital hand. Again, Sarah, if you kind of keep an eye on that, don't hesitate to interrupt me. So when Sarah invited me to this FourSight, you were originally talking about doing this update back in the summertime, like June. And I said, well, let's hold off. Let's do it in September, because we have a student, Nagma Khan, who is an emergency room pediatric physician. And she collected data on FourSight and burnout among emergency room physicians at Children's Hospital in Atlanta. And I knew the data would come in over the course of the summertime. We've had a chance to analyze it. And this is the second time now that I look and I see Dr. Ackerbauer out there, who participated in a faculty retreat a couple of weeks ago. I did a reveal then on this research. So Mike, I'm going to ask you not to ruin the moment for anyone. So, and I've intentionally not, as Sarah pointed out, I've not shared this yet with my FourSight partner, so don't feel like Sarah or Blair have an inside track on this, because this will be new to them as well. So I'm going to share my screen and take you through the PowerPoint slide deck, just to keep myself organized as I go through this presentation. So as many of us know, with COVID, there's greater attention being paid attention to personal well-being and how we take care of ourselves, both physically and in terms of mental health as well. And so I thought I would, especially as the research that Nagma was involved in was looking at burnout, I'd shine a light on how FourSight gives us insights into well-being, as well as the connection between self-leadership and well-being. I have thought for many years, and Sid Parnes, founder of our department, was keen on saying that learning creativity or engaging in creativity isn't necessarily designed to be therapy, but it is therapeutic, right? So as we tap into our creativity, as we exercise our creativity, as we learn to be more effective problem solvers, it gives us the tools to be more skillful at solving and responding to life's complexities, right? Because to live is to have problems, as J.B. Guilford said. And therefore, I fundamentally believe that as we exercise and enhance our creative thinking capacity, we do much to enhance our ability to lead ourselves. And then as a consequence, that has a knock-on effect in terms of well-being. So looking at the trends, last year, Matei Schwartz and I had the opportunity to write a chapter for an updated version of Mike Mumford's book on organizational creativity. And I was assigned to the chapter on organizational outcomes. And the first edition of that book came out in 2012. So what Matei and I did was to go into the literature post 2012 and look at what's being written about in terms of creativity in organizations, and what are the benefits of promoting creativity in organizations. And we ran into something that was a great surprise and a delightful surprise. So if you look at this slide, you see the scale on one side. We have organization, what we refer to as organization-oriented outcomes, which really was the primary driver initially in an innovation driven economy. Organizations saw creativity as something that was necessary to compete, and therefore helped organizations to be more effective, for example, at driving innovation or profitability. Those are organizational related outcomes. But what we noticed when we started to look at the literature post 2012, that there was an expansion in the range of articles and a clear theme on human-centered outcomes in organizations. So not just creativity for the good of the organization, but creativity for the good of the individual in the organization. And we saw articles on how promoting creativity in organizations led to higher levels of job satisfaction. There was a really interesting article on during the COVID pandemic, how looking at the creative problem solving skills of employees helped those who had greater problem solving skills cope with the pandemic, right? To more positively respond to this disruption and so forth. Lots of really interesting articles. We can talk another time about that if you're interested in this, but I think it's fascinating that there's this shift to better balance the view of what are the benefits of creativity within the organizational context beyond just what's good for the organization, but how it impacts and assists employees. And I think this ties into, if you look at the large umbrella, this ties into how we look at creativity intersecting with and promoting well-being. So what I'm sort of kind of positioning, having a framework as a professor, we like to work with models. This is a model in our creative leadership course that we focus on now. The course is designed to promote creative leadership, that is being able to lead others in new directions. Fundamentally, that's where we want to arrive. But moving from right to left, before you can lead others, you have to lead yourself. And there's a movement within the leadership literature to focus on this notion of self-leadership. And as we become more effective at leading ourselves, then we can be more skillful at leading others. But what allows us to be more effective at self-leadership is an enhanced self-awareness. If you don't understand yourself, it's hard to lead oneself. So there's an old story, a monk, unnamed monk, was being interviewed late in life and reflecting upon his life. He was asked to share some wisdom, and the monk said, well, when I was 20, I wanted to change the world. When I turned 40, I wanted to change my community. And when I turned 60, which I can now say with authenticity, because I turned 63 weeks ago, he said, I realized that if I had started with changing myself first, then I could have been more effective at changing my community and then changing the world. So in our graduate program, we're using this framework of, Gandhi, change yourself first, then change the world. Lead yourself first, and then you can impact and be more effective out in the broader world. So I would maintain that you can drop into this as an outcome, enhanced well-being. So as we increase our self-awareness, and of course, FourSight helps us to do that, we can then be more effective at leading ourselves. And when we are more effective at leading ourselves, self-facilitation, we can enhance our well-being. So just like physical health, you don't check the box and say you're done. With mental health, we have to continuously be working on it. So I'm going to review very quickly an article we had published a couple of years ago. Pam Zalay is on this Zoom call. She's a co-author of this article. She at one time worked for the Mental Health Association in Niagara County. And we got together and talked about exploring the relationship between FourSight and dimensions of well-being. And in doing that, we looked at 6 specific aspects of well-being. We looked at anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, perseverance, premeditation, sensation seeking, and urgency. And one of the, I would say, the great benefits of FourSight is, as a measure of creative thinking preferences, it allows us as a tool that concretizes creativity. It then allows us to link creativity to other areas, right? It allows us as a measure, as a tool, to look at the intersection between creativity and many other aspects of life. And so a key component of our day-to-day experience really relates to how well we're able to develop our own well-being. So this is not only about linking FourSight to well-being, but really thinking about the creative process and how the creative process links to well-being. So just quickly as a review, I'm not going to focus on the numbers. I know that for some folks that numbers can be a little frustrating to wrap minds around. Those of you who enjoy numbers, great. You can, by all means, immerse yourself. I don't have to worry about you in terms of looking at these correlations, but I want to talk about the meaning behind this relative to that framework that I showed before, how self-awareness can lead to self-leadership. So thinking about mindfulness, Ken, we were talking about mindfulness before others came onto this call, and self-awareness and how that leads to self-leadership. So I've drawn a circle around the relationship between premeditation and clarifying. And in the world of correlation coefficients, this is a sizable correlation coefficient. So what this indicates is that as one's preference for clarifying increases, so does one's tendency to think things over before acting, to premeditate, to think it over, to think it over, to think it over, to think it over. What are all the things I should anticipate? What are all the things that could go wrong? If you've ever traveled with someone who's a high clarifying person, they need lots of time to prepare for a trip, right? They need lots of information. They have contingency plans. Whatever could go wrong, you know, they're preparing to risk mitigation, right? To reduce any possibility that something could go awry, which is great. However, if you take any thought process and you become rigid about it, it can become an issue, it can become a challenge, where premeditation can prevent one from acting, from doing. It can also lead to worry and consternation. So how does this help with self-leadership? Well, recognizing that this is related to clarifying, right? we can now better manage ourselves. We can say, oh, I'm having a clarifying moment. I'm getting stuck in a clarifying moment. Wow, that's great. If you're aware of that, now you can do things to cue yourself so that you can move along, so that you can mindfulness, self-awareness leads to self-leadership and hopefully an improved state of well-being. Just as an example, I'll give you one more, actually, I'll give you two more examples. So we also found in the research with Pam and our colleagues that sensation seeking, so that buzz of novelty, wanting to try new things, to experiment, happen to correlate significantly with ideating, right? Which makes sense, right? Ideators are open to novelty and literally they get a buzz. The reason why ideators pursue novelty is they literally get an emotional buzz from it. And now we understand what that is, because in the world of psychology, that's called sensation seeking. And so again, how do we tie this into that model that I shared earlier, that self-awareness of, I have a high ideating preference. So that's cool. I'll try lots of different things. I'll experiment. And that's terrific, because that means I'm open to and I'm curious about new potential, right? I'm more likely to go into the unknown unknowns just because I like sensation seeking. That's the upside. But again, any mental state, if it's rigid and fixed, can become a liability, can become problematic. It can undermine well-being. And sensation seeking happens to be related to substance abuse, for example. So where you go too far in experimenting with novelty, you do some things that you become addicted to. You become addicted to novelty. You become challenged in terms of being able to stick with things and refine and craft opportunities rather than always seeking something new. So again, this lends itself to this awareness, right? Lends to self-leadership and managing oneself. We'll give one more example just because this is a negative correlation. And I wanted to share where the two variables are not increasing together in the same direction, but are moving in opposite directions. So we found anxiety was negatively correlated with implementing. So when someone has a high implementing preference, they tend not to worry too much. They tend to just do it, right? As we describe it in the FourSight theory, tend not to worry about making mistakes or worry about what might go wrong. They're driven to move forward, which is a good thing. However, there are some times where you need to stop and pause and think, and where being somewhat concerned or having some level of being anxious stops us from making catastrophic mistakes, right? So not just leaping too quickly, but pausing a moment to think about what might be the risk here and what do I need to plan for. So again, I'm sharing these three examples and I'm hoping they're making sense, because the point I'm trying to drive home here is, as we as FourSight practitioners use FourSight with clients at an individual level, one of the things that we're trying to promote is more effective self-leadership, right? More effective self-facilitation. Now that I understand my preferences and my profile, and I have this framework, how do I, what are the upsides and the downside to these preferences in terms of my life in general, and specifically in terms of these well-being scales. So let me move from there, or I can pause for a second and see, Sarah, if there's anything in the chat box you want to alert me to, or
I think we're actually good to go. We did have one question about, is there any research on FourSight and entrepreneurship? But you can also swing back and touch base on that later. I think related to this, I think we're full steam ahead.
Okay, yeah. There was an article some years ago about entrepreneurship and creativity. In fact, it was an article that also included a measure of attention deficit disorder. I don't have the citation off the top of my head, but Sarah, if folks have access to our publications, I'm fairly sure that that is included.
Yeah,
As
I will drop a link into that, into the chat, and you can find all the published research studies there. Kathy Sue did ask Gerard how you all selected the 6 factors that you studied in that study.
So we're working with Amber Boyd, who was doing a degree in counseling psychology at University of Niagara. And she, along with Pam, selected these 6 dimensions and then went into the literature and found existing measures of anxiety, OCD, sensation seeking, urgency, premeditation, and perseverance. One of the reasons why we chose these is that we assumed we had some hypotheses that they would relate to FourSight and relate to different FourSight scales. So we're trying to find relationships across the 4 FourSight scales, which we did end up discovering. And I'm fairly sure for Kathy Sue and for everyone, when you put that link up for the articles, that will lead people to the article that Pam Selchuk and Amber and I wrote.
Thank you.
So here's the new research. This is sort of deserves a drum roll and a shout out to Mr. Bean, if there's anyone who's a Mr. Bean fan. I thought that was just a fun photo. So Nagma Khan, emergency room physician at Children's Hospital, in our graduate program, wanted to do a master's thesis. And I have to be completely honest. She came to me and she said, one of the issues in the emergency room is burnout. It is, you talk about a volatile environment. Imagine an emergency room in a children's hospital and what that must be like. And so, of course, there's a great concern in healthcare about retaining doctors. And she was interested in looking at how creativity could promote retention and promote well-being among doctors, and being interested in, and a fan of FourSight, she wanted to use FourSight to examine burnout among emergency room physicians. So we looked at FourSight and a measure of burnout, and I realize the acronym here is wrong. It should be MBI, which has 3 scales. It looks at emotional exhaustion. So how emotionally worn out are you from the work that you do? Depersonalization is where one becomes disconnected from one's work, right? You're not engaged by it anymore. Your heart is not into it. And then the 3rd scale on this existing measure that comes from healthcare is called personal accomplishment, which is actually a positive scale. So the first 2 are negative, representative of burnout, emotional exhaustion, and depersonalization. Personal accomplishment is a positive scale showing that the individual feels like he, she, they are making a difference, they're making a contribution, there's meaning in the work that they do, and so forth. So those are the 3 burnout scales that we looked at. We also, and I'm using we there liberally, I should really say Nagma, also created a measure to look at work characteristics like hours of work per week, years in practice, clinical versus research hours. So we also looked at, which most people would say would be strong predictors of burnout, are these characteristics of the job itself, like the number of hours that you're working per week, your number of years in practice, and so forth. So I'd ask you to think about, and this is a rhetorical question, what do you think were the strongest predictors of emergency room physician burnout? And in looking at how we analyzed the data, and we used regression analysis so that we could really isolate the impact of each variable on the burnout measures. We looked at years in practice, hours worked per week, and we looked at creative mindset, FourSight, and the 4 scales: clarifying, ideating, developing, and implementing. And again, from the MBI, the 3 scales that are indicative of burnout are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and remember, personal accomplishment is a positive scale, which reduces burnout. So emotional exhaustion, we have these job characteristics like number of hours worked per week, and it turned out that was not related to emotional exhaustion. So we then looked at the 4 FourSight scales. You can see one is missing. You might know where this is going: ideating, developing, and implementing, and they were not related to burnout. We did find that years in practice was related to emotional exhaustion. However, what we found was emotional exhaustion was low for people who were in practice for a longer period of time. So people who had longevity, right? They had lasted decades and years, were reporting less emotional exhaustion, which also makes sense when you're thrown into a chaotic environment and it's new to you. It's likely that you will feel emotionally overwrought. So that's the other way to look at this. So people who are new to the practice, those who were in the profession as an emergency room physician for a shorter period of time, reported high levels of emotional exhaustion. But here's the interesting thing: an even stronger predictor than years in practice was clarifying. Clarifying was a stronger predictor of emotional exhaustion than the work characteristic in terms of number of years of service. And here, if you were sort of making a hypothesis quickly in your mind, as clarifying preference went up, so did emotional exhaustion. Which, if you start to unpack it, and your own assessment of this, it could be as interesting as my own, because we know the nature of the relationship. We have to unpack theoretically why that relationship exists. But when you think about clarifying in a crazy, volatile, chaotic emergency room situation, you don't always have time to clarify. You don't have time to have all your questions answered, right? And that could be emotionally really frustrating when you want to have answers, where you're pushed to make a quick diagnosis to save a life, right? So that's really fascinating. And for those of you who like numbers and the statistics, you notice I'm ignoring the statistics. I'm giving you the high level review here, but this is the regression analysis. And you can see, for those interested in the regression analysis, the column over to the right shows what's significant. Years of practice is significant at a 0.04. You see a negative relationship here, and the clarifying score is significant at 0.029, which means it's a stronger predictor. And you can see the beta. Holy cow, my jaw dropped. FourSight was a stronger predictor of emotional exhaustion than the work characteristic of years of service. Mindset is powerful, right? Mindset is powerful. So let's look at the other 2 scales. Depersonalization. So feeling as though you're not invested in your work, you feel disconnected, you're not engaged in work anymore. No predictors there. That didn't show any relationship to either the 2 job characteristics or to FourSight. If you love regression analysis, as I do, here's the regression model, and none of the variables came out to be significant. Personal accomplishment, I will take a bit of time to double click on this. Years in practice and hours worked per week, those are our two job characteristics. Neither one predicted personal accomplishment, which surprised me. I thought years of service would be related to personal accomplishment, right? Because you would think the longer you serve in this job as an emergency room physician, you would think that would be indicative of someone who is feel like they're making a difference, a sense of accomplishment. But both of those were not significant. The years of practice surprised me. Looking at FourSight, one of the 4 FourSight scales turned out to be, of the 6 variables, the only variable that significantly related to personal accomplishment. I didn't mute myself, I paused because I want you to fill in the blank. One of these 4 mindsets was significantly related to personal accomplishment, which is a example of well-being that counteracts burnout, right? Because it's a positive scale on the MBI, and clarifying, developing, and implementing were not related. It was ideating in a positive direction. So when physicians, and I skipped over the sample size. The sample size was about 80 physicians. Among these 80 physicians, as the ideating preference mindset increased, they were much more likely to also report experiencing a sense of personal accomplishment in their work. And if you like linear regressions, this is the regression. And if you look down at our 6 variables, years of practice, total hours worked per week, clarifying, ideating, developing, and implementing, only one of the 6 was significantly related, and in this case, in a positive direction. So and I'll go back to the visual, as the ideating mindset, as someone has more of an ideating, think about it, idealistic, optimistic, blue sky mentality, they also report having a greater sense of personal accomplishment as a result of the work that they do. I'm gonna just pause for a second there. I'm in both cases with emotional exhaustion and personal accomplishment, and I'll be very honest, when Nagma came to me, and she's going to watch this video, this will be the first time she'll hear me say this, I had doubts about the value of looking at FourSight and burnout among physicians. And Blair, this is what Blair's father did. This was his career, right? So Blair, I got to tell you, there's so many things that pull on you as a physician to think that mindset would be such a contributor. It really surprised me. So kudos to Nagma Khan, Dr. Khan, for having the wisdom to see the potential here.
Mm-hmm.
So in summary, it turned out FourSight was a stronger predictor of burnout than job characteristics themselves, because we tend to think about, right, with burnout, better work-life balance, quiet quitting now is something that we talk about, how to manage those job characteristics. Well, what this research points to, and of course it didn't look at all the variables, what this points to is self-leadership. Think about be aware of yourself, be aware of your own mindset, and recognize how you can better facilitate yourself as a way of coping with a chaotic situation. And this is one sample, but I think it's a fascinating study, because when you think about that environment, we all talk about we live in a VUCA world, but when you're an emergency room physician, that's a VUCA world, where lives depend on what you do. So again, FourSight was a stronger predictor of burnout than job characteristics themselves. High clarifying was associated with emotional exhaustion. Years in practice was also associated with emotional exhaustion, but the clarifying mindset was actually a stronger predictor than years in practice. And when looking at personal accomplishment, high ideating was strongly related to that counter, if you will, to burnout, that sense of this work is important, what I'm doing, I'm invested in, there's meaning in what I do, I'm here achieving a purpose. That's what personal accomplishment is about. And of course, that as that goes up, you're reducing burnout. So I want to pose a question and have you all have a chance to digest this a bit in a small group chat. Hopefully this was stimulating and you've got some thoughts. So implication in a fast moving, volatile environment of an emergency room, and individuals' creative mindset is a stronger predictor of burnout than are some characteristics of the job itself. So how might creativity training be helpful in those kinds of environments? How can FourSight or creativity training in general be useful? How can we leverage this information in terms of the power of the creative mindset? And it looks like we've got 20 minutes left at our disposal. So maybe, Sarah, if we went to small groups for 5 minutes or so and we puzzled through this, I'd love to hear people's thinking in response to this question, and we can open things up after everyone's had a chance to be in a small breakout group for 5 minutes or so.
Welcome back. I'll let Gerard ask you the questions, but I hope you guys had wonderful conversations in your breakout rooms.
Yeah, so I'm just curious to get feedback here. What you talked about. The question that was posed was, how can creativity training or creativity knowledge be useful as we take this information? How could it be useful to help those in, help to reduce burnout in terms of organization? Specifically, NAGMA is looking at how creativity training could be useful with emergency room physicians. But I suspect you're a creative group. You probably spun off in a number of different directions. So I'm completely open to hearing what you have in terms of insights, ahas, or questions for purposes of clarification. And we'll open it up. Mate, I see you have your digital hand up. And I'm sorry to see you slip through our screen and you got in this session. Oh, sorry, where did he go?
Thank you so much, Gerard, and thank you for revealing all this. This is all new to me. No, it might not be.
You were at that session a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, what's on your mind, man?
We were talking in the breakout room, right? And I think it's something that I really wanted to share with the rest of the group, and especially when it comes to nursing, to nursing, as it just happens, right? That it is healthcare domain that we are very close to, and a lot of as much as I believe wholeheartedly, right, in the training, in the creativity training and the individual training and the individual awareness and knowledge and so on and so forth and self-awareness. I still, I don't think that it's an either or. I think it's a both and, but I would say that interventions at a structural level and letting at a structural level, giving room for creative behavior, or letting space for creative behavior would probably be more efficient than creativity training at in individual level without changing the context or the environment at all, right? Unfortunately, I think that if you are worked out 12-14 hours a day as a nurse, I don't think or at least I'm skeptical that creativity training could help you too much. Whereas using creativity to change the system a bit and to change the structure in a way that allows for creative behavior, I think that would really be impact.
I think it's probably it's a yes and would be my guess, given, I don't know if you're here at the beginning of the presentation when I was talking about the chapter that you and I did together, right? It's both about the structure and the environment as well as the mindset that you bring, and those two things interact with one another. So
and reinforce each other, right? But again, exactly, because Margaret Archer's observation, right, that structure precedes agency, right? So kind of in a at the temporal level, I would again argue that first we intervene through structure, then structure helps people, and then people help the structure.
Okay, sorry.
yeah, well, we could debate about that, and let's make sure we do debate about that, because I could also, I think, equally argue that you could start with the individual, right, as that study that I was referring to that you're familiar with that looked at creative problem solving attitude and skills at an individual level and how it predicted response to the pandemic, and individuals who self-identified as having a higher level of skill set personally were more successful in responding to the pandemic. But I think, yes, structure and individual agency and promoting individual agency through self-development and awareness, they're both necessary. So, but great observation, appreciate it.
You got a couple other hands. There you go.
We'll go Ian, Marisha, and then Mark, just because you're in that order on my screen.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Gerard. Nice meeting you again. We took the class early in my career as a PhD student.
Yeah.
I'm now at dissertation stage. Yeah, I'm with the UVI, University of the Virgin Islands. And my study, my dissertation is exploring teacher burnout and creativity using a qualitative study to look at the power of creativity to offset teacher burnout and promote resiliency.
Great.
And the question that you asked was a very important question, because I am suggesting that resiliency and creativity are related. If you're resilient, then you will be creative. If you're creative, you must be resilient, because you have to find your way out of whatever situation in order to come back to stasis. The answer to your question as to what we can do, I believe, and I'm suggesting in my research, that first of all, we agree on a definition of creativity. When we throw it out to the public, in mass, people believe that creativity is all kinds of things, and they are right. Yeah. So we should hunker down to one definition of creativity. I like Csikszentmihalyi. I like her definition, because it focuses the mind on being resilient, being able to connect oneself with your work for a purpose. Having done that, I believe if we pre-select our doctors based on the information we give them, hey, creativity, there are some characteristics of a creative person. First of all, you have to be positive, you have to be flexible, etc., etc. If people are able to self-check, am I flexible, am I positive most of the times, then I think they can go in with the mindset of resiliency. If they have not checked the boxes, or they have no information concerning how to be creative, how to have that resiliency factor, then I think they will struggle. We would get the data, what is happening, but we would not have helped them. And that is what I'm proposing.
Well, that's a great dissertation, and I wish you great success with that. I didn't touch on resiliency, but I think that's a really important area. And I believe there's a strong connection between creativity and creative problem solving skills and resiliency. Again, going back to the quote that I shared at the beginning with J.P. Guilford, to live is to have problems and to solve problems. I didn't finish the quote. He said to solve problems creatively leads to growth. I think embedded in that, you hear resiliency. So, Ian, I really love that area of investigation, and I'm hoping you come up with some valuable and practical insights out of that. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jump to Marisha and then over to Mark, and that will probably, we'll see where we are with timing, but those two, Marisha and Mark, might be the last two that we'll have a chance to have jump in. Marisha, great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thanks for this great research. It was interesting because in our breakout, we automatically went to our own context of how we work and who we work with to look at, wow, could this apply? And coincidentally or not, last week I was leading an offsite with a pharma client. And when I was going in, the feedback to me was the team was really burnt out because there's a new executive who's come in who keeps asking questions. And so many questions that the team has now made it mean that the executive doesn't trust them. And that was just completely made up. And their previous executive, and who I've met, he was completely hands off. So he just let them, develop and implement their work. So in applying the FourSight, I was just working with the LT to begin with. They started to say, well, has that executive done their FourSight? Because they could see her profile as being a high clarifier. And the tension that was being created in the team because of her high clarifying with and dropping down, that she would ask them to, a question, and they'd have to go out and take a day to answer the question. She doesn't realize that. So in terms of training and development, I mean, first of all, the FourSight opened up self-awareness everywhere for people to ask those questions. And then understanding creative process and, the importance of the 4 stages of creative process and how she may not realize how much she's inhibiting development and implementation in her teams because everything's taking 4 or 5 times longer. So it's the beginning of a conversation with me because I only got to spend 2 days with them, but the carry through of this.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation to look at the impact of one's profile on others. And Ian was talking about burnout, reminds me of teacher bias and how among teachers, they tend to expect students to be successful in accordance to their FourSight profile. So you should be like me. So there could be a little bit of that interplay that's happening, to relate it to another study. But that's a fascinating observation. Yeah, appreciate it, Marisha. Yeah,
hopefully there'll be more FourSight work at a more executive level for them to see the impact of what is occurring amongst their teams. So
yeah, that would be a great research study to look at FourSight preferences and climate, the psychological climate associated.
Absolutely. And I coupled that a lot of work around climate in this team because of that exact reason. And again, the insights were quite powerful. So I think the climate work of ECFL is really valuable in that kind of a dynamic.
Yeah, great case example. Cool. We'll jump to Mark. Mark, great to see you.
Nice to see you, Gerard. I'll try and keep this very brief. I am dubious about the self-awareness piece. The evidence between people having an awareness of themselves and then having an impact on their changing in behavior and emotional states. It's all over the map, and I'm not convinced yet that this is positive. I'm a little concerned if this is used as a selection criterion at some point in the future for jobs or whatever it happens to be. But perhaps, to Matej's point, there is a possibility, for example, if other members of the team know that an emergency physician has this profile, that there are things that they can provide to that physician that they might not normally do. In other words, there are perhaps the awareness of other people about that person. There may be some interventions that are possible.
Yeah. Well, definitely agree with the selection point that you made. I'm optimistic about self-awareness, borrowing primarily from the self-leadership literature. Of course, we didn't test the relationship, in terms of one's own self-awareness. We had the results of one's FourSight profile, but how self-aware they were of that, we don't know. But yeah, I think that's a great caution, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and most of the self-leadership, like I'm a leadership scholar, so that's kind of my research area.
Yeah.
And most of the self-leadership thing is really not at the form of an intervention about helping yourself. It's really about measuring correlations between people's self-leadership things and outcomes, not how can they then change themselves. So yeah, I'm pessimistic, but that's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
We balance each other out.
I'd love to do a study where you provide feedback and then look at what happens post.
Yeah.
I would love to do that. So yeah, without that, it's hard to generalize in terms of that piece. So yeah, I'm convinced. And the latest book that I read on self-leadership, I think creates a framework for this and supports it as well, that FourSight really, the profile links with this model in the area of self-awareness. So I can't lead myself if I don't understand myself. So
Right.
to your point, if I reflect on, I'm a high implementer, I have this tendency to make decisions and drive forward. Now that I know that about myself, when I'm in situation X, I could better manage myself in that situation, which ultimately we hope improves my well-being, makes me more successful. And so I think this is where FourSight reinforces self-awareness. And as you're saying, as practitioners, we can better emphasize this, right, by understanding the implications of the relationships with, like, those 6 dimensions of well-being that we were talking about before. Like, hey, people who have a tendency for high clarifying, you know what, something that you, and this is a correlation, something that you may have a tendency to do is to engage in premeditation, anticipating by looking at a situation that's coming up in the future, like a trip that you're going on, and you might get fixed on it, and you might start to be thinking about all the things that could go wrong and anticipating those, which is great because it helps to prepare you. But also the watch out is don't let yourself get stuck there.
Right.
Because you could become rigid, and that premeditation might turn itself into worry and anxiety. So I'm just giving an example to build on your point. We can give people more cues, right, through FourSight in terms of things to look for.
Yeah.
Sort of like mind cues. And then, of course, in terms of self-leadership, bringing in the CPS tools, methodology, and the principles, now we can move around in the process using our minds to direct our thinking rather than just being where our mindset would naturally put us.
Correct.
So I need to move now from premeditating around clarifying to now I need to build a plan. I need to develop. So I can't just get stuck in premeditation. I need to shift into building a plan and putting that into effect. And that's more managing the process actively, which hopefully all leads to improved well-being. So I think I'm just elaborating, Nick, on what you were saying by saying, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
And I think here's how we might think about that.
And I think that the second quick level on that was I'm thinking wouldn't it be cool if we had some tools and tips to facilitate that. So you understand your preference, you understand the need to do more of the self-stretching, if you will, the self-management, but how? I can see people in sessions going, well, yeah, okay, I get it. No, I understand that I need to really be more, put more emphasis as an individual on clarifying or whatever. But how do I do that? I've been an implementer for so long, all of my life.
Yeah. I think that's one framework that's useful, or theory, in that, and Blair's not on the call anymore. But the work that he did with Liz Monroe Cook on polarities and early warning signals, this is what I was talking about in terms of cues.
Okay,
like, what are the cues that we can help people to understand that make them go, oh, I can see the signpost. Yeah, I've been here a little too long. Maybe I need to move. For like the premeditation thing.
Right.
The cue is, I've thought the same thought 100 times. okay, I'm getting a little fixed on this. It's time for me to move out of premeditation into something else,
Got it.
right? So, and that's something that I know Blair and Liz have been working on. It's something that we talk about in the mindset certification, but that's something we can blow out and as practitioners, maybe give people more cues to pay attention to.
Yeah, yeah. Good stuff. Thank you.
I'm going to take off, folks. I got to get ready for graduate class. Wonderful to see
Great
everybody.
session. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank
you.
you. Excellent session. Bye, all.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks, guys.
Russ, are you gonna?
Bye. Take care.